Good afternoon. My name is Varus Oswe from Switzerland. I get my doctor PhD diploma in Ottawa at Ottawa University in 1997. Then I taught at Moncton University. And in 1998, I came back to Switzerland, where I am working now as a research and teaching assistant professor. Today's course will be on globalization, Africa in the context of globalization. It's entitled "The Ethical Political Challenges of Africa within the context of globalization." And this course fits the discipline political science, the module 3, and reference number 0010.03.05. Specifically, it should be ranked among themes which deal with world politics and international relations. I would like to begin with the following thoughts of man I take to be among the greatest of my civilization. A civilization unable to solve the problems pertaining to its organization is a decaying civilization. In French, une civilisation qui s'avère incapable de résoudre les problèmes que suscite son organisation est une civilisation décadente. This is a thought of Aimé Césaire, one of the greatest men of literature, among the Negro people. He is a good friend of Léopold Sédar Senghor of Senegal, who unfortunately left us this year. The second thoughts come from Mahatma Gandhi. He said, as soon as a person comes to understanding that it will be contrary to her dignity to obey unjust laws, no tyrant can never put her into servitude. In French, it sounds as follows. Dès que quelqu'un comprend qu'il serait contraire à sa dignité d'obéir à des lois injustes, aucun tyran ne peut la servir. Preliminary remarks on the notion of culture, because the course is it's dealing with culture as well. Since it will be a talk about Africa within the context of globalization, African culture, and the global market system and politics as well. The coining of the present theme seems somewhat awkward and puzzling. The choice of terms that give this course its title can seem at first sight awkward and puzzling, for it immediately suggests a clear-cut opposition between the two key concepts, globalization and cultural identity. And it prompts in me the following questions. What is the locus of the things to be globalized? That means, what is the lieu of the things to be globalized? The moment of the things to be globalized. Do these things or items lie outside the realm of cultures? Are they not cultural items as well? since culture is defined as that which, by the human activity, adds to bold nature, that which changes or transforms nature, this is culture, so as to make everything a particular culture and nature as well, globalizable items. The idea here is simply that there can scarcely be any talk of globalization if not of culture. That is, globalization is necessarily globalization of culture, of a given cultural identity, or in plural, given cultural identities. So, as representatives of these given and particular cultures, noble or otherwise, we are all engaged in a process of globalizing ourselves as bearers of cultural identities. What is striking, however, is that people's talk of globalization do not precisely reflect, it seems to me, the fact that the global items are cultural identities at all. They have something really different in mind, it seems to me. And what they have in their mind is at the lowest level. Computers, though it helps us to communicate independently of our borders, national borders. Computers, so for schools and universities, students and academicians, poets and writers, people who like sympathizers of internet, and so on and so forth. But lo, less valuable than that, but heavy with portent or with consequence, in fact, is recorded by UNESCO and pointed at the terrible devaluation of the notion of culture. It seemed to me that the notion of culture has underwent some degradation even within organizations such as UNESCO. This is what I mean. So I urge upon all of us to be careful of these shifts of significations both on the social and the intellectual levels. A report by the UNESCO, UN Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, showed that the world trade in goods with cultural content almost tripled between 1980 and 1991, from $67 billion to $200 billion. At the core of the entertainment industry, film, music, and television, there is a growing dominance of U.S. products. World Trade Organization rules do not allow countries to block imports on cultural grounds. It is argued that one of the consequences of globalization will be the end of cultural diversity and the triumph of a unipolar culture serving the needs of transnational corporations only. It might seem too radical assertion. Hence, the world drinks Coca-Cola, watches American movies, and cuts American junk food. The world drinks Coca-Cola, watches American movies, and eat American junk food. American culture is seen to be dominated by monetary relationships, material values and commercial values that seem to replace traditional social relationships and family values. But the question is, should Americans be vilified? The American culture should no more be vilified than should non-American culture be placed on a pedestal, that means on a level beyond criticism. Both American culture and non-American culture have negative as well as positive side. So we can think about some non-American people's practices usually recalled for criticism, such as, for example, cultural practices as female genital mutilation. I will be talking about this in the course entitled Anthropology of Law. We are dealing with something else which make most of people, 99% of the people of the world, so to say, react negatively against the idea that the world culture is undergoing a process of globalization. And today, when we talk about the world economy, we see an image, a monstrous thing flowing. Flowing is the real word used, because it is capital, money, and in huge amount and a really swift move. You see how Gazeta Bumagi, this is the term I use here. You Russian people, you know what I'm talking about. Bumagi Gazeta. You see how they run at the fabric. That's the way capital flow, or it's flowing. An idea saying it flows swifter than newspaper under production. The advocates of globalization will argue that free and open trade and an expansion of commercial relationships and activities of all kinds are the keys to a brighter future for all. The flaw in this premise lies in the misguided assumption that commerce spurs culture, when in fact the exact opposite is more often the case. The new cultural activists will argue that there is not an example in history where people first create commercial relations and then establish a culture. Commerce and government are secondary, not primary institutions. They are derivative of the culture. They derive from culture, not the progenitors of it. People first establish a common language, agreed upon codes of behavior, and a sheer sense of purpose, to wit, social capital. Only when cultures are well developed is there enough social trust to support commercial and governmental institutions. This is taken from an article of Jeremy Rifkin, World Culture Resists Bowing to Commerce. The capital, a cultural global item. Does capital deserve this qualification, a cultural global item? When President Bush meets with the other leading industrial nation at the G8 conference in Italy in July, weighty topics including economic development, trade, and third world debt will be have been high on the agenda. What's equally interesting has been the agenda of tens of thousands of protesters from around the world who are expected to gather in Genoa. They want to talk about the various ways global corporations like Monsanto, AOL, Time Warner, and McDonald's are undermining cultural diversities and destroying the viability of local communities. Protests are becoming a familiar part of world political and economical forums. But although the attention often goes to the relatively few violent protesters, there is a bigger message worth listening to. The fact is, we are witnessing the first stirrings of a cultural backlash to globalization, whose effects are likely to be significant and far-reaching. Local cultures are reawakening everywhere in the world. In India, consumers recently trashed McDonald's restaurant for violating Hindu dietary laws. In Germany, there is a heated debate over what is German culture in the era of globalization. In France, angry farmers uprooted Monsanto's genetically engineering crops, claiming that they are a threat to French cultural sovereignty over food production. One of them, the leader, is now in jail, I think. In Canada, local communities are fighting to keep out the giant Walmart retail chain for fear it will replace traditional small-town culture with suburban super malls. Globalization is changing the cultural landscape in other fundamental ways. In Europe, native languages are giving way to English, the language of globalization, of internet, especially computer science, of economics and politics. And observers predict an English-speaking continent from Calais to Moscow by the end of the present century. The increasing disparity between the haves and the have-nots is forcing a great migration from east to west and from south to north, resulting in a clash of cultures. As people wrestle with how to preserve their cultural identities in an increasingly borderless commercial world. The agenda being readied the agenda of G8 summit make little mention of this emerging worldwide cultural activism, or they treat them as reactionist. And herein lies the core of the problem. The power that we have long believed that the world is divided into two spheres of influence, commerce and government. They are. Now, organizations representing the cultural spheres the environment, spaces, preservation, rural life, health, food and cuisine, religion, human rights, the family, women's issues, ethnic heritage, the arts, and other quality of life issues are pounding on the doors at world economic and political forums and demanding a place at the table. They represent the birth of a new civil society politics and an antidote to the forces pushing for globalization. The fate of the have-nots. This is another section of my course. The fate of the have-nots, the destiny of people who have nothing, the losers. To offer capital is the meanest comfort. One ought to remark that a capital is also a cultural item, if not the most palpable, though not like a mask, not like Halloween mask or mummies. A capital is a part and parcel of cultural product. It is a feature of one's cultural identity, capital. Otherwise, the question may be raised as what then about people who, though also bearers of given cultural identities, are nevertheless no bearers of the capital's item to be globalized. What about them? They are bearers of cultural identities, but no bearers of capital items, capitalist item to be globalized. That is capital. If globalization has to do solely with capital, maximizing the activities of the haves, entrepreneurial endowments, that means their talents. What a wonderful talent. What about the have-nots then? We or they, the have-nots, may have to wait for our being crushed. They are being crushed by the wheel of the globalizing press or machine. But it is not the case that they have not, including me, have nothing to do with the globalizing machine, since the same system that encouraged the entrepreneurial talent to be developed by their owners is the same that grants us our right not to be eliminated, slaughtered by the globalizing press. The UN system is what stands as advocate of the losers, the have-nots, but it also stands as advocate of entrepreneurial development. It is the same system that consecrates our right to claim for life, for more equality, and moreover, for a redistribution of the world's wealth and a fair redistribution. Maybe our part in the whole bunch of fate is restricted to our claiming for these rights and not getting any result worth considering. Then there follows a mortal clash of interest, not less mortal than the capital will in its pressing us down or pressing the have-nots down. So the awkwardness and the puzzle generated by the coinage of the theme fade away, and we more clearly understand why globalization is not at all or just a little in accord with cultural identity. What I mean here is that the clash between globalization and cultural identity, African cultural identity, and African within the process of her own globalization, is not something to puzzle us. There is no paradox to talk about the two. Since to take the problem at stake seriously, we may admit that we are dealing with life and death problem, life within some cultures, the lives of the have-nots. This is not a mere logical problem, the mere coinage of a conference or a course or a seminar paper. Therefore, one should ask the question, why is it that globalization, the flow of capital, may endanger not only our cultural identity, since an identity may be conceived of as a state of thing lying between a rigid, if not a frigid, unproductive status and evolution or progress, an ongoing metamorphosis. Why then is globalization a danger for some culture, for the poor countries? As Max Weber held it, the German sociologist held it. As he held it, Max Weber, Protestantism with its underlying rationalism is the catalyzer of the spirit of capitalism. Max Weber took rationalism as the mover of capitalist machine. If this is true, then the question of the development and the perpetuation of culture, other than those placed under the impulse of the Protestant ethics, is a real problem. Are we then condemned to apostasy in order to stand firm in the concert of civilization, in order to duly contribute in this process of globalization? If you have to increase, to develop, are we to change our religion? Are we to adopt the Protestant way of thinking, Protestant vision of the world? The rise of capitalism may be due to quite another factor than that diagnosed by Max Weber. Amintore Fanfani, an economic historian in Rome, in one of his articles, Catholicism, Protestantism, and Capitalism, even disagree with Weber concerning the role that Protestantism has played in the development of a capitalist spirit in Europe. In his opinion, the conclusion of his investigation announced in the first paragraph, Europe was acquainted with capitalism before the Protestant revolt. For at least a century, capitalism had been an ever-growing collective force. Not only isolated individuals, but whole social groups, inspired with the new spirit, struggled with a society that was not yet permeated with Protestantism. He has ruled out the idea that Amintore Fanfani has ruled out the idea that Protestantism could have produced a phenomenon that already existed. Amintore Fanfani. Okay. Amintore Fanfani, however, has left the question open to know whether capitalism was encouraged or opposed by Protestantism, and his answer is not the less far from the Weberian trends of thought. For according to him, many early Protestant leaders opposed capitalism, including Luther and Calvin. Luther's conservatism in economic matters, to which his patriarchal ideas on trade and his decided aversion to interest bear witness. Even Calvin, it said, condemns as unlawful all gain obtained at a neighbor's expense and the amassing of wealth. The Huguenot and Dutch reformers also preached against various aspects of capitalism. Through the 16th and 17th century, we find a continual repetition of the prohibition of usury issued by the Synod of the Huguenots and by those of the Dutch reformers, whose ethical codes also condemn even excessive labor as robbing time and energy from the service of God, and held action born of desire for gain to be a sign of madness. Fanfani argues that capitalism, as we know it today, was born in the Italian merchant states under the religious umbrella of Catholicism. But he discounts the effect that religion of any kind had on the growth of capitalism as the major world economic system. He concludes his article by stating, the creation of a new mentality in the economic field cannot therefore be considered as the work of Protestantism, or rather of any one religion, but it is a manifestation of that general revolution of thought that characterizes the period of the Renaissance and the Reformation, by which in arts, philosophy, morals, and economy, the individual emancipates himself from the bonds imposed on him during the Middle Ages. What is to be concluded from this counter-argument? That there unavoidably is in fact a turn of mind, a certain type of thinking there serve as a catalyzer of capitalism, a certain type of rationality, a conclusion nothing more or less than the result of Weber's investigation, at least partially. Nowadays, it seems obvious that after the rise and the development of capitalism under the strong impulse of the Protestant ethics, capitalism has underwent a crucial turn since the 19th century at least. A turn that stripped the effect capitalism of its first cause, its first impulse, but also a turn that enabled other cultures to attune themselves willy-nilly, they want it or not, to that spirit of capitalism. But how can we be sure of the total absence of this cause from the substratum, that means from the root, from the basic level of capitalism, so as to engage ourselves in the capitalist project and today in the process of globalization? In any case, it may be, as some advocates of capitalism or globalization say, that the wealth of some may help sustain the lives of others. The question of the redistribution is there at hand, itself raising another more crucial question that plunges us deep within the fact of human nature. And this question is the following: how can people ready-made or just ready, that is, without their maker's God's impulse, ready to crush others by their divine talent, entrepreneurial talent, which is an inalienable right, how can these people who are not able to understand why it is reasonable not to step out the boundaries of what they are essential and or a little bit more than their essential needs for their lives, will come to understanding, how these people will come to an understanding of the need of other people, such to help them within the process of redistribution of their wealth. Were they reasonable enough and factually capable enough to share their wealth such to sustain their lives of others within and without the boundaries of their countries? Will there be a need? Will there be a need now to share their wealth with others? More important, who will bring them to such peak of understanding, to such level of understanding? Their states, world coalition of benevolent or benefactor states, the United Nations system of regulation? These are the questions to be asked. The United Nations endeavors to its utmost possibility to make things work in this direction, but who is or who are the most wealthy providers of the United Nations funds? The giants of the world, those who are crushing the poorest down, the world powers. These are the bailleurs de fonds of the United Nations. But we all know what they are capable of, those world powers. They have been the motors of the globalizing process, at least since the dawn of liberalism, that is, since the 16th and 17th centuries. This is where the question and need of the redistribution of the global patrimony leads us. To this question, I think the most conspicuous answer, and indeed may replace us deep within history. History is the test. History is the proof. History has proved enough. It is not an abstract question. It is a question to be taken seriously by experts in social and human sciences. Question to be provided with even answers from outside the realm of science. I have in mind theologians within the realm of their competence, for there is also known as the social ethics of the church. There is also science within the church. But what will follow when the redistribution of wealth is under implementation. We may say that we need to adapt and thoroughly cultivate the rationalist art of thinking for and as product of cultures other than prompted by capitalist way of thinking. We might be considered as not truly rationalist. We may say that we need to adapt and thoroughly cultivate the rationalist art of thinking, for as products of culture other than prompted by capitalist way of thinking, we might be considered as not truly rationalist. Here a couple of questions arise. What does the word rationalism means here? Or what sense should we give the word such to form our mind and make us true participants of the process of in the process of globalization and development of capital and market economy? Are we able to adapt and cultivate the rationalist art of thinking if we are not living under a culture dominated by the capitalist turn of mind? How can in Africa, in Asia, East and Central European cultures, which are not formed and fed by the type of rationalism and ethics at stake, can stand the waves, the turbulency of the present state development of capitalism? It is worth noticing that there are more than one type of rationalism, all of them deriving from a theoretical framing of thought, from a systematization of thought through a particular Weltanschauung or vision of the world. The Weltanschauung or vision of the world which lies at the basis of the capitalist turn of mind is not that of the other traditions or culture of the world. Though we all know nothing prevents the rest of the world to adopt the capitalist Weltanschauung, nothing prevents the rest of the world to adopt it. It seems we do not measure in all its contour, in all its aspects, this kind of cultural roundabout section of people's history. The spread of globalization will undoubtedly bring changes to the countries it reaches. But change is an essential part of life. It does not mean the abolition of traditional values. Indeed, new global media, such as the Internet, have proven a powerful means of projecting traditional culture and the culture of radical opponent of globalization. To the extent that globalization does imply some integration of culture, this may be no bad thing. Tribalism and fundamentalism have been divisive sources of violent conflict throughout history. And economic ethics is not a simple function of a form of economic organization, and just as little does the reverse hold, namely that economic ethics unambiguously and ambiguously stamps the form of the economic organization. Externally, similar forms of economic organization may agree with very different economic ethics, and according to the unique character of their economic ethics, how such forms of economic organization may produce very different historical results. Capitalism is essentially diverse, as the traveler from Tokyo to Hong Kong, Zurich, Buenos Aires, and New York will discover. The fact that American culture products are successful in world market reflects no more than their popularity. U.S. cultural exports are strong, and it is influential. That reflects the success of the U.S. economy and the popularity of its products. A given economic ethics is always determined by culture. So, in the face of man's attitude towards the world, as determined by culture or other, in our sense, inner factors, spiritual values, for example, an economic ethics can have no high measure of autonomy. The test of the viability of globalization, history. It's another section. For some cultures, globalization is rather a Selbstmord, that means a suicide. For some cultures. This is the case of the weak or developing countries. It seems, as some people say, imperialism, capitalism, and now globalization are rather underdeveloping ways for we people from those countries that are poor. History is the only one test for the viability of globalization. But what does history of nation teaches us from antiquity to these days, passing through the century that have seen the European trade and power rising? What history has taught us? The case of Africa. This is what we are going to deal with now. The great African cultural past. This subsection will deal with the great civilization that Africa in the past has been able to build and to share with the other part of the world, especially Greece and Rome. The international legal seal of globalization is quite new, while the phenomenon of globalization itself is as old as the great civilization the world has ever known since the antique time. Here I refer to antique Africa, who through Egypt, Ethiopia, Timbuktu, Guinea, Gao, Shanghai, Benin, Guinea, Ghana, and or the Ashanti, Zimbabwe, etc., not only has taught the world, the Greeks especially, but antique Africa has also globalized her body of philosophy, sciences, arts, and techniques, but she has also contributed with her trades and productions in the concert of nations. If the Marxist criticism of the doctrine of natural law is judicious and pertinent, acceptable, and if it's really the case that modern doctrine of natural rights is erected in the defense of the rich and mighty ones over the poor and the needed, it is far from being the case with the classical doctrine of natural law and or natural rights doctrine. Here I am specifically alluding to the well-known story of Antigone in Sophocles' tragedy and to the Stoic doctrine of natural rights. For in the first case, the right of man, namely Antigone's brother, is opposed to the might and the totalitarian rule of Creon, who has forbidden the burial ceremonial in favor of his nephew. And in the second case, most interesting on the point of view of the systematization of the doctrine of natural rights, these rights foremost seem to be the privileges of the exploited. Why is this to be held true? For the Stoics, each creature, animate and inanimate, hold a position and function both within the cosmic whole and in society for what concerns a human being. Cicero has exposed this doctrine in his Republic. But while this line of the doctrine come closer to that of Aristotle, Stoic, unlike Aristotle, astonishingly at that time already not only have been radical in their opposition to the Aristotelian trend of natural slavery. Furthermore, Stoics have held for an undisputable truth that all genders are equal. Thus, they have been the first philosophers to propound the principle of gender equality, of specific right to children, of masters to slaves on the domestic plane, or, if you want, in common law. There is even a dramatization of this doctrine of the Stoics, the doctrine of equality, in Diogenes Laertius, who have reported on the sixth principle of Zeno, Politeia, that Zeno requires that both men and women should wear the same dress and that no part of the body should be hidden away. They should be naked, such to show that they are equal, such to show that they are in tune with the cosmic order. No part of the body should be hidden away, that to show equality concretely. On this doctrine, it is said that skeptics like Cassius and his successors have criticized Zeno. They went so far in strongly emphasizing this principle as to hold in for true the idea of community of men and women. Men and women should share themselves as one should share goods. Men and women indiscriminately should wear the same clothes, even etc. These are Stoic system of thought. At the time when Aristotle were writing and teaching his philosophy, and when the Stoics were so radically defending their doctrines of natural rights, so radically, I say, Greece was not included among the European countries. It was a Middle East nation. But the fact of their not being European didn't prevent them of edifying such doctrine that manifestly recognized the natural worth of human beings. And more than that, it should be recalled that the Greeks are greatly indebted to the thoughts of the ancient Egyptian thinkers who were not of the white race at all. For the ancient Egyptian thinkers, the pharaohs, kings and queens, first inhabitants of the Nile Valley, and builders of the pyramid, the teachers of Pythagoras, Democritus, and the other Greek philosophers are the Anu of the High Nile, the today Nilotic Sudan. People who have been inhabiting the Nile Valley came from the center of Africa, and they are called Anu, A-N-U, or Ani, rather Anu, A-N-U. And what is more striking, why I'm talking about, refer to the Stoic, this is what is coming. What is more striking, today it is known by many that the founder of the Stoic school was a black man, nicknamed the Black Palm Tree, to suggest his blackness, the well-known Zeno of Citium. This information clearly shows that the Western civilization is far from being the cradle of humanism or human development. Even Christianity is not Western, for Christianity is Asian. From Palestina or Syria, as some people want it to be. And Palestine or Syria are not European countries. Africans have also been great administrators in the Roman Empire. While in the past, globalization in Africa roughly means the internal management of resources, with nations, mainly intellectuals, coming from far abroad to acquire knowledge, and in the field of trade, with principle of equity ruling the commerce among nations. Globalization in the modern era, however, presents itself in a four-stage process, all of them having a manifestly negative bearings on the continent's Africa's integral and sustainable development. This is true for Africans at home and abroad. Another session. The rise of capitalism in today's African economy. Western liberalism has got its masters, moderate as well as radicals. Political figures as eminent as John Locke, we have written our master's thesis on John Locke, his political ethics. And it has been an important thesis that's awarded as a prize ranked among those who have completed their doctoral thesis. That was in '92 in Switzerland, among Switzerland-speaking university that has been. So, political figures as eminent as John Locke stand as one of the most radical liberal in the field of economics, while at the same time he is known as one of the most moderate liberal political thinker. This is why we have chosen to write our master's thesis on him, because he's moderate political thinker, liberal. Globalization and the uncontrolled flux or transfer of capital finds its advocate in the wise Locke, as Voltaire calls him. His essay entitled Some Consideration of the Consequences of Lowering of Interest and the Raising the Value of Money bore witness to the fact. For there Locke has laid down the moral practical basis for the prohibition of governmental control on the flow, the transfer of capital, and for the hiring or lending money on interest. This he has done on the ground of the individual right to private property and the right to the free use of one's private goods. According to John Locke, for a government to prohibit a control systematically at least such activities to cause the ruin of a nation's trade, which is the foundation of a nation's wealth. It is to forsake people, abandon people whose only property solely resides on or depends on finance, on capital. Categories of people such as widows, orphans, and this led to the total destruction, Locke say, of the English crown, the collapse of England. Is Africa economically and politically mature enough to engage in the process of globalization of its economy within the framework of this capitalist thought or liberal thought? This is the question to be raised. If not, and we all know this is the case, Africa is not mature enough. The great powers are dragging the poorest country within their race, material race, political, economical race. At least in the moment things should be rearranged, new basis should be provided for this process of globalization in order to enable poorest country to get some benefit from it. We all know this is the case, that Africa is not economically or politically mature enough to engage in the process. Since globalization of one's economy means maximizing it with one's possessions, Africa has nothing to offer, or she has enough, but the money is siphoned or taken away from Africa by her rulers. So maximizing it with one's possession is globalization. Maximizing one's economy is maximizing one's possession. But what about a country or continent who has nothing? This short study is to provide some reflection. This section of the course is to provide some reflection on the phenomenon. Once again, the black continent with the new cyclone-like economy seems diving in an enormous disaster where she alone can redeem herself by her own efforts. For the world economy and politics lie in the hands of the few mighty ones who, ceaselessly hunting their own interest, care not about who and how miserably atrocious the other's death is looming ahead. In Africa, the four stages of process of modern era globalization rather displays the invasion of really destructive external forces. The first stage of this penetration corresponds to the 400-long system of attempt of enslavement process, mostly via the Arabs and sold in the so-called New World to initiate the prosperity of that continent. Black people today, yesterday's mere properties, les biens meubles, are trying, just like Jews, to make their claims for compensation of the economical, social, and psychological drawbacks heard by the international community. They are making their claims heard by the international community. Indeed, the loss that nothing can compensate. The second stage bore the mark of colonization, where the new great nations of Europe share Africa, the cake among them, raising artificial barriers among people in the way this will help them to easily govern Africa. Most of African ethnic conflict of today are caused by cultural, political, and religious structures and systems inherited from colonization. The greatest damage to African economy was the obligation of commercial agriculture and the prohibition of subsistence agriculture. The third stage is the so-called neocolonialism, of which Pope Paul VI underlined the imperialistic character, stating, "It is a form of political oppression and of economical suzerainty devised to maintain and acquiring domination." The struggle for independence in the 50s and 60s has enabled a great number of African states to establish local government, but this could not have broken the strong ties of foreign influences in future Africa. Trade system, investment policies, debts, paying arrangements, etc. On the contrary, reinforced former conditions which are far from benefiting Africa. Now we're heading at the fourth stage. There's no need to waste time about it. Statistics foreshadow the fate of Africa. The OCDE countries have become thrice powerful than in the 60s, while the greatest part of humanity still live in poverty. It should be admitted with Valaskakis that of the three most important economical questions, the what, the how, and for whom the first two, that mean the what and the how, are fundamentally answered, while the third remains and should be solved by experts in social sciences and politics of all countries of the global village. But what solution and for whom, since no viable alternative can be offered by none of the economical giants to help the poorest countries out of their wreck? Will the globalization benefit Africa or the poorest countries of the world? I share the radical position of Professor Young Jack Kim of Cookman University, answering no, at least not in the moment, unless some change have been established in the world politics and relations. Africa has nothing to gain from it now, at least not in the moment. It will be very difficult for Africa, as in the past, to adapt her national institution to the scheme of the globalization. It's difficult unless democracy or the apparatus of good governance, a control of the power, should be established before. And it will be very disastrous to force Africa or the poorest countries of the world to abruptly change their institution when their economy and her society is so completely overwhelmed by so a profound crisis of today's world. Africa should give herself the opportunity to initiate reforms and develop a modern economical system before, out of her own pace, that is, out of her own rhythm, and with a huge aid or help from the international community. This reminds us of Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the United Nations, recent urgent appeal for the management and the restriction of the flow of capital. Therefore, the first rule of all nations, we should say, of goodwill and of the international community is to help Africa and all the poorest countries solve their serious problem of poverty and mostly of good governance. Africa is rich enough, like my country, Togo, is rich enough because in a month, more than what the country has toward the European country or the Western country as debt is taken away from the country. It should be added with grave emphasis that Africa and the poorest countries do not refuse to develop. It is plain and simple fact that there is no country in the world which casts herself aside from the world economy. So when we say that no, Africa should not engage in the process unless something has been done or unless there's some new configuration of politics or economy has been established, this means not that Africa should cast herself aside. And no country in the world, this is my mind about, can do that. We are dragged out of it. Whether we like it or not, we have to follow the pace, but at our own rhythm. The International Festival of the African Textile, PANCA, in 2001, last year, was held in Lomé, capital of Togo, some weeks ago. Before 9 November. That was on 9th of November 2001. So the International Festival of the African Textile was held in Lomé, capital of Togo. Its manager was no other than a company called Global Excel International, a Togolese private cabinet specialized in the assistance, support, counseling, and the promotion of the development of quality enterprises. The Nana Benz, that means the huge mamas who sell clothes, textile, who lead at the leading machine of the textile commerce in Togo, they are called Nana Benz. So these Nana Benz of the Togolese capital do always circulate in Benz, Nissan and Toyota. But here too the difference seems to be plain. Far from being limited to its mere economical purpose, the organization of such festival proceeds from the will to celebrate an event of social cultural importance. So the Dark Continent is still attuning her own system, is still managing to participate within the world's economy and politics. Is still adapting its own system of production and subsistence to the rhythm of the economical giants. Even if these giants, since a decade ago, find more efficiency in other countries like Latin America, other continent, or other countries, excuse me. Even the most fearful of the anti-imperialistic countries, the former Soviet Union, has undone the ties linking her to countries of socialist orientation such as Angola, Mozambique, Ethiopia, South Yemen, etc. This has occurred in the 80s when she had been, that means the Soviet Union has been confronted with the challenges arising from her competition with the West, the capitalist imperialist camp. Not for any other reason than to more easily face these challenges. Her wish when she was concluding her alliances and was spending about 15 billions of US dollars for their support is to extend her influence to the third world, so to other poor countries as well, such as Afghanistan, Cambodia, etc. With Gorbachev, the support in favor of the third world countries was no more considered as a necessity because of the competition that opposed the Soviet Union to the USA. From that on, the Soviet leader expected his country to establish and maintain normal relations with the third world independent of their ideological orientation and choice. This policy has been intimated to Ronald Reagan in 1985 at the Reykjavik summit. The happy result of this 180 angle, the disengagement, unlike the Brezhnevian politics, has been the political and pacific solving, or at least appeasing, of the regional conflicts in collaboration with the UN and USA. However, the Black Continent still engorges with enormous potential means of existence, natural and human as well. Means of existence have to do with people's capacity to subsist by withstanding and surviving shocks and stresses, and bettering or improving their material conditions without endangering the existential condition of others, both in the present as in the future. Strong potential of creativity and innovation manifest themselves during the past 10 years in the continent, among which my country, Togo, despite the huge waves of mechanism of impoverishment, both within from local government as without from foreign forces. The so-called resistance of the African society to modern streams of development rather shows an unshakable awareness of a self-affirmation as a country of the future. Say Philippe Engelhardt, L'Afrique miroir du monde, Africa, the mirror of the world. The so-called resistance of the African society, he said, to modern streams of development rather shows an unshakable awareness of a self-affirmation as a country of the future. Africa finds a deeper interest in cultivating the fundamental values of humanity, its through, that are embedded in her culture as far as possible, more than in stirring up today's economical cogito. Je vends, donc je suis. I sell, I am engaged in commerce, therefore I am. This is the economical cogito. I'm a businessman, therefore I am. Africa has something else to do than to stirring up this today's economical cogito. Africa in this perspective is rather quite positively challenging the one-way development model since the 70s. In fact, those who call themselves economical giant countries, if not particulars too, are also faced with the same problems like the poorest. There are some other countries and some other areas or parts in New York, in the United States, in France, in Belgium, that they are politics, economic disregard. Like Pope John Paul II raised some key questions about the process of globalization. We follow him. We raise the same question. And these are some of them. Will everyone be able to take advantage of a global market? Will relations between states become more equitable? Or will economic competition and rivalries between conflicts between peoples and nations lead humanity towards a situation of even greater instability? Thus, this question, together with Pope John Paul II, we call for a globalization of solidarity too. A globalization without marginalization. This is his own terms. These are his own terms. We call for this instead of a globalization of economy only, or this present state economy, or economical principle. Solidarity is a central theme of the 1987 encyclical, The Social Concerns of the Church, where John Paul II criticizes the structures of sin that mark so much of a globalization driven by profit and power. And in the discussions of the African Synod in 1994, a distinctly African emphasis provides us with an ethical criticism of the globalization, with a model of the Church as the family of God. As such, the Church must be an instrument of universal solidarity for building a worldwide community of justice and peace. This position is widely shared in Africa today. It's with this word that I close this course today. Thank you for your attention.